So let's start with the story that everyone has seen. The East Wing is being demolished by President Trump to build the ballroom that we've been hearing about. What are your thoughts on kind of what's happening, the significance, and what it tells us?
Yeah, the symbolism seems almost too much on the nose, doesn't it? I mean, the
Right.
metaphor of Trump's presidency, taking a wrecking ball to our institutions, to our history, to the laws, and that's all playing out. And also, he's doing it without any real checks or balances on him. I think people are looking around and saying, "Can the president of the United States, who's a temporary resident in the White House, just knock down part of the White House just on his own whim? Is there nobody? There's no process you have to go through?" And apparently the answer is there's a process, but he controls that as well. And plus, as Trump has done so often in the past, he does the destruction first and then, leaves everybody else to pick up the pieces. So it does feel as if the metaphor of the Trump presidency just keeps pounding us, in the face. I mean, a week that starts with him posting a video of himself essentially dumping a load of feces on fellow Americans, and then following that up by taking a literal wrecking ball to the White House. In case there's any question about what he's all about.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's the ongoing lesson that president who wants to do dramatic things might be able to just get away with it if his party is behind him, and he breaks the norms or the expectations that we have of presidents, and he just moves ahead and does it, and very often it's just too late by the time the conversation happens, and the Republicans in Congress are just standing still, apparently okay with this.
They're not around. Well, see, that's the thing is, it's nice. It's not clear that even Republican voters are enthusiastic about knocking this down. I mean, there are polls out showing that only 24% of Americans think tearing down the East Wing is a good idea. But not only are Republicans standing still, they're just not around. I
Right.
mean, this is one of those moments. There was a piece in the New York Times this morning, which I'm sure you saw. Where's Congress? What a great question. The Congress is providing no check, no balance to the president on these sorts of things, and they're not even in town, and that just speaks volumes to the political moment that we're in.
And can you talk a little? I saw in your newsletter you mentioned this nominee for the Office of Special Counsel that has now failed, Paul Ingrassia, and the discovery of the texts that allegedly he was sending around. Again, in the context of how conservatism has changed, how you've talked about it, where does that small story fit into understanding the mentality, mindset, disposition of MAGA republicanism?
Well, I wish it was a small story, and I wish it were more shocking. Why this keeps happening? This story broke the week after we got the story about the text messages involving all those prominent young Republicans, and I think, what is the old adage about, that your character is what you do when you think that nobody is looking when you're in private, and so we're seeing a little bit of what's going on to the right wing conservative movement, when you lift the curtain, and on one level it ought to be shocking. On another level, as you talked about, look, after 10 years of marinating in Trumpism, what did we actually expect? If you are rising in MAGA politics in over the last decade, who were your role models? What was acceptable behavior? What are the incentives? What is the price to be paid? Now, in the case of Paul Ingrassia, he was so extreme, so deplorable. The position he was being appointed to was so grossly inappropriate, the Office of Special Counsel in the Department of Justice, that even Republicans who have swallowed so many other awful appointees looked at him and said, "No, this is ridiculous." But the fact that he was even up there in this pantheon of misfit toys that have already been approved by the Senate just speaks volumes that his background was not disqualifying until that one Politico story.
And not all. I mean, I didn't totally follow the final stages, but not every Republican said no, did they?
No, and No,
Yeah,
they didn't. At least not in public.
yeah.
But again, have to keep asking the question: why does this keep happening? Why does this keep happening? When you pull off the scab of Donald Trump's Republican Party, that people behave like this. Now, you and I have talked about, the trajectory of, republicanism and conservatism, and there's no question that race and, some of these right wing ideas have always been a recessive gene on the right, and they've struggled with them. They've always been there. It's not Donald Trump did not invent them. What he did was empower them. He brought many of these ideas, from the edges of the fever swamp. And there was a decades long, maybe 2 decades long project, maybe 3, 4 decades long project that Republicans had, conservatives had, of saying, we are not that. We are going to put that part of our past behind us. We're going to excommunicate that. We're going to turn that around. I mean, think about the things that conservatives like Jack Kemp, even during the Reagan era, or John McCain, or the Bushes tried to do, at least rhetorically in public, in saying we want to put a different face on the Republican Party. We're disowning our racist past, and now what we finding out? The mouth breathers are back. I mean, they're back and they're flourishing, unless they're really caught.
And what's striking is also toleration, meaning when these things emerge, there's not an instant widespread condemnation from everyone. It's not a
Everyone.
kind of party moment of outrage as you would have had with the David Dukes of yesteryear. Now, except for a few people on the kind of lowest bar, uh, there's just tacit acceptance. And that says more than anything, in my mind, of where the party has shifted.
Can I go back to the taking down of the White House? Because I do think that, and again, we go back and forth on what is conservative about modern conservatism? I mean, at one time, didn't the word conservatism actually mean you conserve things? I mean, what I've been arguing is that this is not American conservatism. This is radicalism, and we're living through a revolutionary time. In a revolutionary time, you pull things down, you tear things down, you destroy norms, you undermine institutions, continually shock the system. And I saw somebody online, and I'm sorry that I didn't identify. I think maybe it was Don Moynihan, who made a really great point that MAGA conservatism, or the MAGA right, gets deeply upset when, say, Cracker Barrel changes its logo, but is completely okay when Donald Trump tears down the White House. I mean, I want you to think about this weird cul-de-sac of culture war, bizarre standards that we're in, where they get all worked up. How dare you desecrate the Cracker Barrel logo? And yet, yeah, no problem with ripping down the entire East Wing after the president had promised that he wasn't going to be touching the structure of the White House. No problems for a lot of those.
And you'll remember, I mean, I was actually just teaching about Reagan, and we were talking at the inauguration, which came under criticism. The first inauguration, it was opulent and a lot of wealth, but Reagan fundamentally was still trying to kind of restore the image of the presidency and kind of make the contrast with Carter and elevate what the institution was. And you can have
Dignity.
criticism. This is just destroying it. And it's kind of a striking contrast between how the two men, Trump and Reagan, think of what conservatism is in their time.
Well, that's right, and also you have the added layer of the kind of, once again, the let the meat cake moment, where you're building this gaudy, golden ballroom for your rich friends, being paid for, through your various shakedowns with your billionaire friends and business friends, at a time when there is real economic anxiety out there, and that, maybe that hasn't fully played out. But given Donald Trump's insistence that I am the people's president, right? Does the people's president tear down the people's house in order to build a ballroom for his rich buddies? And one of the great themes, his most effective themes of 2024 was, you know, they are for them, I am for you. Well, on issue after issue, whether you're talking about, the bailout of the Argentine economy and telling, saying we're going to be importing Argentinian beef, and all the cattle ranchers are going, wait, what happened to America first? or building these gaudy ballrooms at a time when people actually are starting to feel that sticker shock at in the grocery stores.
And last weekend, of course, which feels now weeks away, there was the No Kings rally and huge turnout. And not just, I keep saying big numbers, but a spread geographically, regionally that's pretty significant. If I was a Republican watching this, the red states had a lot of No Kings protesters. What did you make both of the protests themselves and the Republican response, especially Speaker Johnson, the way they characterize it, the ferocity they seem to go after these protests?
Yeah, how disgraceful that was, and what a total refutation the reality was of what they were saying. You have Mike Johnson, who is, I mean, this guy comes out every day and shows how little backbone he is and how little character he has. I mean, the notion that this was a hate America rally. Look who is going to come out: Hamas supporters, Antifa. Actually, you know who came out? Fellow Americans. Senior citizens, people with baby carriages, people carrying pretty well written signs. There were, where I was, there were no, Palestinian flags. Nobody behaved badly. There were a couple of incidents here and there, but it was overwhelmingly peaceful. So what was interesting was that Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, he obviously has time on his hands since he's shut down the entire Congress, um, is out there smearing this in a way that actually felt dangerous beforehand, that when you start to say that your opponents are terrorists and extremists, you're creating that permission universe to perhaps use force. So it was it was very impressive. I went to one in Cedarburg, Wisconsin. I worried all day that something was going to happen, that this whole thing would be remembered for some bizarre incident, and it was not. So this was a triumph, but it's one of those things that's necessary but not sufficient. It doesn't accomplish anything unless it translates into actual political action. But I have to say that it was necessary because part of the authoritarian project, as we have discussed before, is to convince you that everything's hopeless, that you cannot resist, you can't do anything. And when millions of people turn out and they look around and they go, "Hey, we are not alone. We in fact represent the majority of the American people. Donald Trump does not speak for America." Um, that has an effect. That morale boost is not insignificant.
Of course, the ugliest part of the day was his AI image of him going to the bathroom on the country. I mean, the irony of the Republicans saying it's a hate America, and then no, people have American flags and are calling on American values, and then he sends that out is just kind of I don't even know what to say about it.
Well, it was certainly telling that I mean, first of all, it was an AI image of himself with King Trump flying a jet, which of course he could not do, dumping a load of feces on peaceful protesters. Now, if you and I would have had one of these live streams, we said, the problem with Donald Trump is Donald Trump, wants to shit on fellow Americans. He wants to dump a load of crap on America. People would say, "Oh, come on, guys. First of all, how incredibly tasteless, and number two, you really suffer from Trump derangement syndrome." Trump says, "Hold my beer. I'm actually going to put this out," and it felt, and again, like the wrecking ball at the White House, the symbolism seemed very much on the nose.
Yeah, and most presidents wouldn't own the title of king when being the center of these protests. He literally owns it, and is through this image saying, "Yeah, I am king," which
Well,
is
well, and
so revealing.
most presidents would not advertise their incontinence. I mean, so it's like we're so off the double president, chart at this particular point, and it really does feel like it this week. That it feels more raw, but whether it makes a difference or not, we don't know. Although I will say that the number of Americans that are concerned about Trump being a dictator, abusing his power, uh, is those numbers are solid and they are significant. Now the question is whether or not that can be translated into actual electoral success, given the obvious, naked, unsubtle attempts by Trump and the Republicans to fiddle with and to rig the 2026 and 2028 elections.
And what do you think that comes next means exactly? I mean, I'm sure there will be more protests. I'm sure groups like Indivisible are not stopping. But what, and for me, I mean, thinking of conservatism and thinking of the civil rights movement, what would have to happen now to turn this into that political force that you're talking about?
Well, it's going to we'll see what happens in Virginia and New Jersey within a couple of weeks, right? We'll see what happens to the turnout. Are there a large number of Democrats who will sit home, who will not turn out, or will we have a wave that'll give us a first indication right away? I also think that we've had a number of demonstrations though recently of the effectiveness of collective action, and I think that we ought to celebrate some of those wins. And I talked about this the other day. The more I think about it, the more I think that the Disney Jimmy Kimmel story was pretty significant. Disney was weighing the the balance of fear, and they were more afraid of Trump and of the FTC than they were of their own viewers and talent. And so they canceled Jimmy Kimmel. What happened? Well, there was collective action. We're now finding out that there were millions of people that canceled their Disney subscriptions, canceled their Hulu subscriptions. And what happened? Disney turned around, put Kimmel back on. If you watched at all, he is not holding anything back. I mean, not at all. So that was a success. Also, the universities, which I think had been sort of in stunned disbelief at the attack from the administration, had been caving in, and over the last week, you saw that they were again looking around, seeing that what they don't have to buy into the requirements that the administration was putting on them, and they said no. That was positive. I think the media, which has had a very shaky first 9 months, that solidarity you saw at the Pentagon, I think, was not insignificant. So I think that without downplaying the risks and the dangers, we also ought to take a moment to celebrate some of the successes and be reminded that collective action, in civil society can make a difference.
I would also just add a reminder that collective action is often incremental. We look back on the civil rights movement and see the outcome, the successful outcomes. But along the way, it was a million small points of victory. It was, and then often, moving backwards because of intimidation or defeat. And so, this arc of history really takes time, and we're in a fast pace culture, and there's a lot coming at the country. But we do need to remember that. So I think you're smart to point to these as very significant and might be turning points in some ways in the long run.
And along those lines, though, I think we should also remind ourselves of the power of peaceful protest. Donald Trump, I think, was really rooting and hoping that the protests would turn violent. In his world, in his mind, as the executive producer of all of the carnage, that's why he was using this the rhetorical slams against the protests. Why you had governors who called out the National Guard. Had they turned, had they turned violent to any extent, it would have played into his hands. It would have played into his argument that we are at war with the enemy. With the civil rights movement, also, we had this tremendous success in the middle of the 60s. You know this better than I do. But when violence began to break out, public opinion began to shift, and you saw this tremendous backlash against it. So I do think that as long as, what I would tell people right now is protest peacefully while you can. This is the moment. It's like there is still a window to be able to do this. I am, and again, I don't want to be misunderstood here, but there may come a point where people are going to have to say we'll need something like a general strike, or we'll have to do other things if in fact it appears that the other democratic outlets are blocked. But right now, the power of peaceful protest, of consumer action, of moral solidarity between universities, law firms, journalists, um, that I think we need to remind ourselves that can be very effective.
And I would add to that that Republicans in Congress, business leaders, people with influence watch this. They are not President Trump, and they're balancing the fears they have of angering the president and his base versus fears of everything from economic retribution through a boycott to protests. And it's not, they have an eye on this. And it's kind of, can you tilt it one way or another? I wanted to turn to the shutdown. Before I do, though, as always, thank you for all the subscribers who are watching us and listening to us, enjoying the conversation. And thank you for all our paid subscribers to the contrary and the long view for supporting us. This is how we make it work. And we hope some of you might consider upgrading to a paid subscription to let us keep having these conversations and supporting independent media at a time when I really think this is part of creating a healthy civic society, given the pressures everyone faces. The government shutdown, now we are many weeks into this without any apparent endgame right now. What do you think of where this is going or how it's unfolding for the parties?
Well, I've been asking that question, what is the end game? And I know you wrote about that this week. The Democrats have made, put all their chips into onto the table on the question of healthcare, the healthcare subsidies. But there's a lot of other things that are out there, and I'm trying to get my head around that moment where if Donald Trump says, "Okay, you get the subsidies, I'm going to give that to you." What do Democrats do? Do they say, "Yes, we're going to fund the rest of Donald Trump's government"? I don't know. What do you think about that? Because I think that this is a big hole in their argument.
No, I agree, and I think I understand the strategy, and I understand that healthcare is a very good issue for Democrats, but I think they did lose something by not putting front and center why they don't want to negotiate with an administration that is not living up to previous congressional authorizations. And that's technical at some level, but it's at the heart of the No Kings protest, which is drawing a lot of people. Americans don't like centralized power that's abused. It's just part of the history, the DNA of the country. And I think that was lost. They all look at some point, Democrats also believe in government and governing, so they will concede. I mean, it is inevitable. But I think the rhetorical firepower of that particular point has kind of gotten subsumed to a debate over ACA like it's any other moment in shutdown history since the 90s.
No, I agree with that, and I agreed with what you wrote earlier this week. And part of this is the problem of dealing with this moment as as if it is conventional politics, kind of the normal shutdown politics. You negotiate and come up with some meaningless compromise that can hand down the road. I think this again, one of the problems, and I said this before, is you have conventional politicians who are leading at a time of very, very unconventional politics. I think Donald Trump actually understands that all the rules are out the window. I'm not sure the Democratic leaders in Congress has fully grasped that.
And the final kind of question I had for you, and how worried do you think Democrats should be about their own polling right now? Is that a major concern, or is that something for midterms that won't be as central as the person that the midterms will actually be about?
Well, I think, look, I think they ought to be worried about it because I think all political parties ought to be worried. In my experience, the politicians who are not worried are the ones who are taken by surprise. But the Democrats have a lot of work to do, and they need to acknowledge that. And I hope that people who are listening to this understand that you have to do several things at the same time. We have to, understand what Donald Trump is doing and the danger that he poses, but also we also have to ask why has he been able to get away with it, and how dangerous it is for the opposition to fall into bubbles, falling in love with candidates who can't win elections, refusing to acknowledge mistakes that were in the past, not being focused on what it takes to win. New York Times had a really interesting analysis of the electoral power of moderates in both parties, how well they do. And it should remind people that the majorities will, the majority makers are the people in the swing states and in the swing districts. not the bright, shiny objects out there. So I think they ought to be worried. They also ought to be a little bit more open to the kind of self-criticism that I think that all political parties that have gone through a horrific defeat need to engage in. The danger, I think, and I'm sure you've seen this as well, is that because we silo off, people say, I don't want to hear anything negative. I don't want to hear any advice about how Democrats have got to win the midterms. If Democrats do not win the midterms, um, 2028 is going to be a real nightmare. So I think that people need to be laser focused on winning those elections and not be in a bubble or in denial about some of the political problems they still have.
Mm. Okay, on that note, Charlie, we will bring this conversation to a close. Charlie Sykes, if to the contrary, and the two of us will be back, and we have a lot always to talk about. So thanks for joining the long view.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.